Night falls over the broken skyline of southern Ukraine. The power grid shivers, and the horizon glows with scattered fires that refuse to die down. Sirens rise and fade like waves, echoing through empty streets. Somewhere between fear and exhaustion, a rescue team drags a hose through rubble, calling out names that the wind swallows. A few hours earlier, the night had been dense and ordinary. Street lights flickering, children finishing homework, a father closing his shop's iron door. Then the first detonation cracked the air. Windows burst like glass rain. The city's heartbeat stopped. CCTV cameras later showed a streak of light crossing the darkness before everything went white. Russia's newest round of missile strikes had landed, this time crashing directly into civilian blocks instead of frontline targets. The impact sent shockwaves not only through concrete, but through global headlines. And while firefighters battled the blaze in Ukraine's silent dawn, another story was already forming hundreds of kilometers away along Russia's southern coast. A channel of oil pipelines stretching from the refinery to the docks. Around midnight, security cameras at one of Russia's main export ports flickered, then failed. Within minutes, a thunderous bloom of orange and smoke lit the waterfront. Ukraine's counterattack had arrived. Revenge, swift, calculated, unmistakable. Between these two explosions, one taking innocent lives, the other shaking a nation's economy, lies the truth of modern warfare. Retaliation moves faster than reflection. Every blast invites another. Every loss demands an answer. Tonight's story isn't only about missiles and fuel depots. It's about the rhythm of violence, the choices behind it, and the people left standing in the smoke trying to understand what comes next. The escalation that unfolded this week has already been called the sharpest tit-for-tat since early 2024. One missile strike shattered the sense of routine on a quiet Ukrainian evening. Hours later, flames tore through one of Russia's key oil ports on the Black Sea. Two flashes of orange, separated by distance but bound by cause. In this investigation, we follow the chain of events that linked those two explosions. The attack that struck civilians, the retaliation that hit the lifeline of Russia's energy export, and the geopolitical ripples spreading far beyond the smoke. Our approach is simple. Piece together verified reports, satellite snapshots, and on-ground footage to rebuild the timeline minute by minute. We'll trace who ordered what, how targets were chosen, and what each side claims to have achieved. Behind that headline lies a deeper story about strategy and emotion. Grief driving decisions, politics turning pain into retaliation. It's a story of infrastructure wars, where pipelines and refineries become as symbolic as flags, and where ordinary lives blur into military calculations. This episode isn't about cheering for one flag or blaming another. It's about understanding a dangerous rhythm that keeps speeding up, strike, counterstrike, and the shrinking space for diplomacy in between. As we roll forward, keep one question in mind. When every side justifies its own response as revenge, who decides where defense ends and destruction begins? To understand how two explosions could rattle half a continent, we need to unwind the clock. The chain reaction didn't appear out of nowhere. It has been gathering tension for months. An accumulation of smaller clashes, intelligence leaks, and energy wars that turned each side's logistics into battlefield targets. In the early months of the year, Russia intensified its long-range missile campaign against Ukrainian cities. Analysts described a new pattern: large salvos timed to overwhelm air defenses, hitting substations, railway junctions, even schools and hospitals near the industrial belts of Kharkov and Odessa. Ukrainian officials called it an attempt to freeze civilian morale as much as disrupt supply lines. Western satellite images, meanwhile, revealed growing heat signatures around Russian oil infrastructure, likely new defensive installations anticipating Ukrainian drone strikes. By March, Ukraine's drone program had evolved from small tactical models to larger long-range variants built with domestic and volunteer technology. These unmanned vehicles began striking deeper into Russian territory. Oil depots in Bryansk, a refinery in Ryazan, power nodes feeding military production zones. Each hit drew both condemnation and applause across social media and sparked debates about whether Ukraine was extending its fight beyond defense. At the same time, on Russia's southern coast, the blank oil port kept operating around the clock. Tankers queued along the Black Sea route, carrying millions of barrels per day, crude essential not only to Russia's economy, but to global energy markets. For months, the site had been considered too heavily protected to face a major strike. That assumption, as events proved, was misplaced. International observers noted 3 critical dates leading up to the current escalation. T-72 hours. Multiple Ukrainian border regions experience coordinated missile alerts. Russian ministry statements describe precision strikes on military targets, yet local footage shows residential damage. T-24 hours. Ukrainian Security Council announces increased surveillance of strategic energy supply chains in response to civilian losses. Amateur tracking communities online report unusual drone movements heading east across the Dnipro. T+0 hours. Detonations ripple through a southern Ukrainian city. Confirmed civilian casualties. Within the day, explosions erupt at the Russian oil port, sending plumes visible for kilometers. These are not isolated acts of aggression. They fit a repetitive rhythm that began when the invasion entered its 3rd year. Russia targeting civilian morale, Ukraine answering on economic infrastructure. Each round pushes both militaries toward escalation, while diplomats plead for restraint from the sidelines, increasingly drowned out by sirens. Energy analysts warned that the latest destruction could disrupt export flows for weeks, indirectly affecting fuel prices from Istanbul to Rotterdam. Meanwhile, families on both sides sift through wreckage, wondering how many more cycles the conflict can sustain. That's the timeline leading us into the present moment. 2 nations locked in strategic retaliation, civilians again paying the highest cost. The first impact came without sirens. Electricity had flickered minutes earlier, and that brief silence fooled people into thinking the alert was just another false alarm. Then the ground itself answered. One deep thud, a second sharper crack, and a column of dust turned the horizon into ash. The missiles, launched from the northeast according to Ukrainian Air Defense Command, cut through the evening sky faster than anyone could react. Local sensors registered 3 detonations in a straight line across residential districts almost a kilometer apart. The first collapsed an apartment building that housed families of school teachers. The second ignited a trolleybus depot. The third gouged through a market square still lit by vendor lanterns. Cameras mounted on building entrances captured only fragments, headlights swaying, then an incandescent flash whitewashing the frame. When the feed returned, the street was gone beneath a cloud of gray and orange. Fire crews scrambled from nearby districts while power lines dropped across roads. The city's main hospital switched immediately to generator supply. Within minutes, civil volunteers joined emergency teams, forming lines to drag fire hoses and shovels. Many had done this too many times before. They moved with practiced disbelief. Among them was Dmytro K., a 27-year-old paramedic who had already resurfaced survivors during previous bombardments. Later, in a televised interview, he said quietly, "The smell tells you before the eyes do." He and his team spent 4 hours navigating walls that leaned like sails after a storm. Each tap of a crowbar carried the hope of another living voice. Ukrainian Interior Ministry briefings released at dawn confirmed civilian casualty figures, but avoided exact numbers until families were notified. Officials restated that no military targets stood within the blast radius. Russian statements, using official news channels, claimed the strike had targeted a depot storing foreign munitions. Satellite images reviewed later showed no trace of such a facility within several blocks, only the skeletal remains of residential towers and parking lots filled with burnt vehicles. While politics turned the tragedy into talking points, the city itself endured a paralysis that numbers can't measure.
Streets once crowded with cafe chatter transformed into corridors of glass shards. Families took shelter in basements lined with damp mattresses, checking mobile phones for loved ones still missing. Social networks filled with photos of smoke pillars, captioned with single words, "Alive?" International reaction arrived by daybreak. Messages of condemnation poured from European capitals, each echoing familiar phrases: outrage, violation, unacceptable civilian targeting. Humanitarian agencies dispatched assessment teams, though access remained restricted due to unexploded ordnance scattered across courtyards. By mid-morning, journalists wearing flak jackets stepped carefully through puddles of chemical dust, broadcasting live among twisted beams. Inside command centers, Ukrainian officers reviewed radar data, mapping the missile trajectory backward. Their conclusion: the launch came from long-range bombers stationed hundreds of kilometers away, well outside Ukrainian reach. That distance added salt to the wound. The attackers had faced no immediate retaliation risk. When sunset returned 24 hours later, smoke still climbed from the heaps of rubble. City workers raised what remained of the national flag atop a half-standing administrative building. The gesture wasn't for ceremony, it was so rescuers could orient themselves. Through the haze, color was the only direction marker that remained vivid. Beneath that cloth, commuters, parents, and elderly residents lined up for bottled water. The frustration in their eyes mixed with fatigue, but resentment was already hardening into resolve. Each conversation ended with some variation of, "They will answer for this." And they soon did. As the final pockets of fire died down and investigators sealed off the site, a new operation was being prepared hundreds of kilometers away across the sea, a response designed not with words, but with precision. The call for retribution emerged before the ashes cooled. Every Ukrainian newsroom, telegram channel, and briefing desk echoed the same phrase: "An answer will come." At 8 p.m. the following evening, a line of rumbling cargo trucks slipped out of a concealed hangar in central Ukraine, each carrying a different part of a coordinated message to the other side of the sea. No official ever confirmed the order, but intelligence communities across multiple nations began noticing changes in the electronic airspace. Radar pings vanishing near the Dnipro, shipping trackers in the Black Sea blinking offline. Something was moving. Ukraine had spent the previous year refining a new generation of long-range drones, composite-body aircraft with adaptive navigation, low-altitude flight paths, and guidance systems designed to mimic the irregular patterns of migratory birds. These tools were originally framed as deep reconnaissance devices. Tonight, they became the instruments of retaliation. At approximately 01:17 a.m. local time, a cluster of objects appeared on Russian coastal radar. Operators first assumed routine civilian aircraft anomalies. Within 30 seconds, alarms filled the control rooms. Security footage from nearby installations later showed streaks of light skimming across the sea surface at astonishing speed, followed by a synchronized burst of flames at the perimeter of the port. The night turned stark white for 10 seconds, then darkness devoured it again. From offshore ships, sailors described a distant sunrise across the water. Emergency klaxons wailed through the harbor as fire suppression systems fought to contain blazes along loading piers. Each tank of stored crude ignited sequentially, creating a chain effect that resembled an enormous ring of fire curling around the coastline. Russian state media paused for several hours before acknowledging an incident involving industrial infrastructure. Unverified clips circulating on social nets, however, showed shock waves rippling across the bay and tugboats scrambling amid falling debris. By dawn, satellite data from Western monitoring stations confirmed that at least one major storage facility had sustained direct impact, with heat signatures exceeding recorded fires from previous sabotage attempts. Ukrainian officials maintained deliberate ambiguity. One presidential advisor tweeted a photograph of calm sea waves with a short caption, "Energy should light homes, not fund terror." No mention of drones, no claim of responsibility, only a riddle that the world already understood. Behind the symbolism, the tactical reasoning was plain. The port fed nearly 10% of Russia's oil exports. Disruption there would translate instantly into both economic loss and international attention. Analysts suggested that the strike served three interconnected goals. 1. Demonstrate technological reach. 2. Answer civilian casualties without crossing NATO red lines. 3. Undermine Russia's perception of rear area safety. By targeting infrastructure rather than residential buildings, Ukraine could position its act as strategic retaliation rather than emotional vengeance. Yet to the crews still extinguishing fires along the docks, the distinction hardly softened the devastation. One firefighter, recorded in local broadcast, said, "You can't tell strategy by the color of smoke. It all burns the same." As dawn spread over the bay, satellite images revealed a surreal scene. Black smudges drifting over the water surface, cranes twisted like open metal hands. Coast Guard fast boats sprayed foam across the inferno, while drones from Russian emergency services hovered overhead, filming from angles never meant for publicity. Energy agencies began rerouting tankers to alternative terminals farther east, producing temporary shipment delays that nudged global crude prices upward within hours. Inside Russia's capital, early morning briefings were tense but restrained. Officials vowed restoration in the shortest possible time and declared all attacks on its energy system acts of terrorism. In Kyiv, spokespeople neither confirmed nor denied involvement, repeating instead that war will not be one-sided.
For civilians watching from apartments, still patched with plastic window sheets, the glow across the sea was more than a military success. It was catharsis after shock and grief. Telegram channels filled with messages of pride intertwined with caution. Satisfaction that their country could respond, mixed with the understanding that every retaliation invites one more payload in return. By late afternoon, smoke from the port drifted so high it merged with the clouds. Air traffic radar recorded a haze band stretching 150 kilometers out to sea. Reporters on nearby shores described waves coated with a thin rainbow sheen of leaked oil. Environmental observers issued warnings about marine contamination. Economists speculated about energy volatility. Diplomats whispered about escalation thresholds. Through it all, the symbolism remained unquestioned. Attack civilians, lose ports. Whether that moral arithmetic brings justice or simply perpetuates the loop remains uncertain. But one fact was clear. The narrative of the war had gained a new chapter, where infrastructure struck back, and revenge found its mark not through speeches, but through a single night's fire over the Black Sea. The back-to-back strikes illustrate a transformation in how this war is now being fought. Instead of armies clashing on a single front, both sides have opened systems warfare, targeting the lifelines that keep a modern state functional: energy, transport, psychology. From a purely military standpoint, Russia's original assault on civilians achieved little tactical value. Pulverizing residences seldom changes frontline positions. Its purpose was almost certainly psychological: to weaken resilience, drain attention from the battlefield, and force Kyiv to divert defense resources from soldiers to civilians. Historical parallels are easy to find. When immediate territorial advances stall, punishment of morale becomes a substitute goal. Ukraine's retaliation inverted the equation. By striking an oil port rather than populated centers, Kyiv redirected the pain toward infrastructure that directly feeds Moscow's war budget. The message was layered. You hit our people, we hit your fuel.
Analysts at several defense think tanks have described it as economic deterrence by disruption. The logic? When conventional deterrence fails, make escalation too expensive to sustain. Strategically, the damage extended well beyond the flames. The port's temporary paralysis forced Russia to reroute tankers to more distant terminals, stretching logistic lines already strained by sanctions. Each added nautical mile increases cost and risk. Each day of delay touches global markets. Oil traders in London marked a brief but noticeable uptick in crude futures within hours of the blast, a sign that the modern battlefield now runs straight into energy graphs. For Ukraine, the operation demonstrated capabilities once thought improbable: deep-range precision without direct NATO hardware. The psychological boost across Ukrainian social media was immense, proof to many that their engineers could reach targets once shielded by geography and politics alike. Yet that very reach invites strategic dilemmas. Hitting farther means provoking deeper, and escalation ladders are notoriously slippery. Moscow can respond with intensified barrages or cyber attacks on Western suppliers aiding Ukraine. Diplomatically, allies walk a narrow bridge. Western governments publicly reaffirm the right to self-defense, but privately worry about direct strikes deep inside Russia, fueling uncontrolled escalation. The thin line between defensive counter-operation and offensive retaliation is more a shadow than a border. Economically, even a short disruption resonates worldwide. The Black Sea corridor exports millions of barrels of oil and agricultural staples. A few fuel tanks less can send shockwaves down shipping insurance, freight rates, and inflation indexes. What began as a regional military exchange thus morphs into a global supply chain stress test. The environmental cost also enters the calculus. Satellite sensors detected thin plumes of hydrocarbon vapor drifting west for 2 days after the blast. Marine biologists warn that cleanup will last months. In this era, wars leave spreadsheets along with scars. Then there is the human dimension. Vengeance as a strategic variable. Retaliation, understandable at street level, can become counterproductive at command level. Both governments face the same paradox. If they don't respond, they look weak. If they do, they risk uncontrolled escalation. As one analyst phrased it during a televised debate, each success writes an invitation for the next tragedy. The dual strikes thus form more than a cause and effect loop. They signal a doctrinal evolution. Long-range precision has turned war into a conversation conducted through explosions, each side answering with its own vocabulary of fire. And in that conversation, civilians, economies, and even ecosystems become punctuation marks. Every graph of tonnage or barrel has a heartbeat behind it. Beyond control rooms and radar feeds, there are the people who live at ground zero of statistics. Elena M. still wears the same gray jacket she had on the night of the missile strike. She was wrapping pastries at her bakery when the shockwave tore the shutters from the windows. The glass embedded in the dough tray still lies on the counter, laminated now as a kind of personal monument. She keeps working in the half-repaired shop, selling bread that smells faintly of disinfectant. People must eat, she shrugs. If I stop baking, the noise wins. 200 kilometers away in Russia's Novorossiysk region, Sergei a shift engineer at the damaged oil port, hasn't slept properly since the explosion. The explosion threw him across the floor of his monitoring booth. He woke up under the glow of an emergency light, his headphones melted into plastic ribbons. He insists he's lucky, no burns, only ringing ears and a shaking hand. What disturbs him most isn't the fear, but the silence that followed. The sound stopped, and I understood how loud life used to be, he told a local paper, before the article was quietly removed from its website. Both of them,
Elena and Sergei serve systems larger than themselves, the industries of bread and fuel, warmth and motion. Their worlds should never intersect, yet they now share identical anxieties, sirens, sleeplessness, the sight of co-workers counted like inventory. In shelters and workshops on both sides, these small human calibrations of courage repeat endlessly. Parents make water bottles look like toys, so children won't think of shortages. Sailors patch ship holes with jokes to mask trembling hands. Psychologists say the population is adapting, but adaptation in this context means accepting fear as part of daylight. The war's abstractions, sovereignty, deterrence, escalation, melt into ordinary rituals, sweeping shards from a stairwell, rewiring a generator, sending one more text that ends with, "Stay safe." These gestures do not change strategic maps, but they keep the space for humanity open between alerts. When historians chart these weeks, they'll mark coordinates, not names. Yet it is names that carry the meaning. Elena, Sergei, the rescuers, the firefighters, the children coloring tanks into butterflies. Their quiet persistence is what survives when the echoes fade. The war no longer lives only in trenches or turbines. It thrives on screens. Within minutes of any explosion, competing versions of the same event race through every platform, each trimmed to fit a narrative, each demanding belief before verification. When the civilian strike occurred, Russian state channels immediately framed it as a high-precision operation against weapons depots. Carefully edited clips showed crosshairs over what looked like empty lots. Ukrainian broadcasters countered within an hour with live footage of shattered apartments and interviews from emergency shelters. Both sides published proof of truth, maps, timestamps, eyewitnesses, but few viewers waiting behind keyboards cared for nuance. In the information front, speed outweighs accuracy. Sympathy is a resource to be harvested fast.
The retaliation at the oil port triggered an even sharper online duel. Russian networks labeled it a terrorist act. Ukrainian commentators celebrated it with coded memes of fireworks over the sea. Western outlets split along political lines. Some hailed a daring blow to Russia's economy. Others warned of reckless escalation. A single 20-second clip of the burning refinery gathered more views than most official briefings combined. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage holds attention. Every slogan, #Justice for the City, #Energy for Freedom, creates virtual factions whose members may never set foot near the front. Analysts call this participatory warfare, a battle fought through clicks, shares, and emotionally charged solidarity. The casualty is clarity. Governments know this. Both invest heavily in digital influence units. Crews of editors, hackers, and designers craft narratives in real time, shaping not just perception abroad, but morale at home. In a sense, no strike is complete until it trends. For journalists, the task becomes nearly impossible. Report, verify, resist manipulation, all while broadcasting to an audience conditioned for spectacle. Facts feel slower than feelings. As the smoke clears over cities and ports alike, the information haze remains thicker than the real one. Winning hearts online may never end the conflict, but losing the narrative can reshape its course. Every strategist now looks at two intertwined questions: what comes next, and how far can escalation stretch before diplomacy snaps? Defense institutes in Europe and North America read the twin strikes as a turning point, not just another exchange. Their consensus, warfare over infrastructure, will intensify. Russia, according to open-source tracking, is moving additional air defense systems toward major oil complexes and revising radar protocols for coastal regions. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues refining long-range drones and striking symbolic as well as logistical targets. Both sides signal determination, neither signals limits. Economists foresee turbulence rippling far outside the war zone. Temporary port shutdowns already nudged oil futures upward. Extended disruption could redirect global trade corridors through the Caucasus and the Mediterranean. The price of crude may become a barometer of escalation. Cybersecurity specialists also warn of expanded arena. If physical supply chains become too well protected, digital ones may offer the next opening. Diplomatically, there's faint hope of substantive negotiation. Western envoys press for humanitarian corridors, yet mutual suspicion blocks sustained talks. The vocabulary of proportionate response is eroding. The word revenge increasingly occupies the space once reserved for strategy. One retired naval commander described the dynamic succinctly. Neither side wants war to grow, but neither will be the side that blinks first. Humanitarian planners read the same pattern through a darker lens. Protracted retaliation cycles mean more displaced families, more infrastructure collapse, and another generation defined by alarms rather than calendars. As reconstruction funds shrink and militarization budgets rise, the social fabric stretches thinner with every reprisal. Still, analysts remind us that exhaustion has its own gravity. Wars that expand too far often collapse under their logistical weight. Some predict a tactical stalemate emerging before year's end, not peace, merely pause, a breathing space for fractured diplomacy to try again. The sea returns to its usual rhythm. The same tide that once mirrored firelight now erases the smoke in quiet layers. Here, the echoes fade faster than the consequences. Harbors will reopen, streets will be swept, and night will again smell of fuel and salt instead of ash. Yet for those who lived these hours, normal will never look quite the same. Historians may record this episode as one more exchange in a long chain of retaliation, defined by tonnage, payloads, and strategic effect. But within that data are small, persistent details that refuse to vanish. A rescuer's cracked glove, a melted pair of headphones, a bakery window patched with tape. These fragments whisper the only constant truth of modern conflict, that behind every calculation stands a human life, often anonymous, always fragile. Across the horizon, politics will spin new statements, alliances will shuffle, and analysts will chart new risks. Still, somewhere, sailors will watch the sea's empty line and listen for the next siren. The waiting becomes its own kind of battle. In the end, nothing about this story feels final. Every silence carries the potential for another explosion, every truce the shadow of another provocation. Yet amid that uncertainty, endurance endures. The act of rebuilding, the stubborn choice to keep caring, the quiet insistence that even in an age of drones and data, humanity itself must be defended.